can move on to part three, which is myths. I called it myths and methods. And first, I
Mhm.
would like to discuss very common beliefs that we often run into when we're reading about SCT, but that may not be maybe accurate. So I would start with belief one, which is some people
Mm.
believe that SCT is a theory of scaffolding. We already mentioned this.
Yeah, yeah. It's
So,
not. It's not. And you can read our paper that one of my students in China and I wrote, Shi and Lantoff, 2021,
okay.
uh, that explains why it's not scaffolding. And I think I explained that already. The scaffolding
Yes.
is just getting you through a task, and it's not really resulting in development. It could, but it's not looking at the activity as a way of developing a learner.
Okay.
It's task focused rather than development focused.
Okay. Very good. Let's go to belief number two. Some people
Yeah,
may think that ZPD is equal to the concept of I plus one, which is also a very
yeah,
popular concept in teaching.
yeah. That's the most pervasive and the most damaging myth. And we haven't been able to somehow force that out of the SLA thinking and the thinking of teachers. Um, the I plus one has nothing to do with other people. With ZPD has everything to do with mediation with other people. And the I plus one is a very vague term because as other people have criticized it, you don't know what it is until it actually happens. So you can't say what the plus one is, right? Until you actually see what happens. Whereas the ZPD is about actually a view into the future based on how learners respond to mediation over time,
Mhm.
right? So it's a developmental process, and I plus one is I'm not sure what it is,
Okay.
right? Um, and it very much is about the individual person, right?
Yeah.
And this goes to, I think, your question about, I think somewhere in there you had a question about metaphysics. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the problem,
Yes.
are we
Yes.
coming to that?
You were going there. Yeah. We'll building.
Okay,
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
okay.
But then we can follow with belief three, which is SCT is equal to language socialization.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting that Vygotsky makes a distinction between socialization and socializing. So for him, socialization is the process through which higher functional system is created. It's not about bringing somebody into social behavior. It's about bringing someone, it's about developing the person's mind, the person's psychological system. He uses the term socializing to talk about what I think other people would mean by socialization. So he makes this clear distinction
Okay.
so that so that the cultural development of the child into an adult mind, adult thinker, is the process of socialization. You're socializing the mind. You're creating adult consciousness,
Okay.
right? That's what he means by socialization. Socializing is, learning how to behave culturally appropriately, the way I think most people use socialization
Mm-hmm.
now, right? So to
Yeah.
use language communicatively, I don't see any psychological side to the socialization literature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I may be wrong, but I don't see uh, them worrying about cognition and uh, about the formation
Yeah.
of higher system
Yeah.
as a
It seems to
consequence of
be.
socialization.
Yeah. It seems to be more about like normation.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
normation.
yeah.
Okay. Very good. And then next belief number four is that learning or language learning only happens in the ZPD. There is no autonomy, no other tools like textbooks, dictionaries.
Okay. So autonomy is the result of development, right? That's self-regulation. Self-regulation is autonomy. You can't, so this whole idea of letting learners learn what they want to learn, this discovery learning, this inquiry-based learning
Mhm.
is anathema to the Vygotskian view of pedagogy and to Galperin's view of pedagogy. You need other people. You need cultural tools. You can't do it by yourself, right? So this idea of learners don't know what there is to learn. right? So when you start learning a language, you have no idea what there is to learn about the language. You need somebody else to guide you through the process, right? You don't have any idea what the language concepts are like. Um, so discovery learning, uh, um, a guy named Karpov
Hmm.
wrote a really interesting paper about this in 2003, criticizing inquiry-based learning and this kind of autonomous learning uh, in supporting the idea of concept-based instruction and Galperin's notion, because from this theoretical perspective, you need mediation to become autonomous. So
Hmm.
the goal is autonomy. It's not the starting point.
Okay.
The starting point is dependence on somebody else. The
Hmm.
end point is autonomy from that other person.
Yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting. So we have, of course, a lot of uh, communities online, people learning languages, communicating, passing on advice as to how to learn language. And all
Mhm.
these communities, they call themselves self-learners. So it
Yeah.
would be interesting to know how does a self-learner fit into SCT?
I think it's always possible that there are exceptional people who are
Mhm.
capable of learning a language or learning anything on their own. But I think that's rare. What about, the other 99.9% of the population who can't do that, right? And even the so-called self-learners, you have to wonder how far they can actually get. If you remember that work that was done by Smith and Simply on this language savant, I don't know if you read that work.
Mhm.
Um, it turns out that, this person was supposedly able to learn, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 languages very quickly. But when you probed at his level of competence or proficiency in the languages, it was not that good. He was very good at learning sort of, the basics of
Mhm.
all these languages, but he wasn't very good at developing seriously high levels of proficiency on his own,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so you you
I think
need other people.
I think even if someone is a self-learner, they're still relying on other people in indirect ways.
Sure.
Because people will upload the tutorials, they will use
Yes.
books
Yeah.
are
It's
books are
yeah.
written by other people and so forth.
Yes. Yeah, and this goes to something that very much disturbs me in the new materialism, and that's this fact that artifacts have become fetishized, right?
Okay.
Because they don't see, as Marx pointed out, they
Mhm.
don't see the fact that there's social labor involved in writing a textbook. So it's not an object by itself,
Mhm.
right? It's somebody creating that has a particular effect on you,
Yes.
right? So, but we don't see the person any longer. We don't see the social labor that went into creating that artifact,
Mm.
right? We just see the object.
Mm.
So we fetishize it, right? The chairs that we're sitting in, we don't see the labor that went behind the creation of these chairs that compels us to sit in certain ways and not other ways, right?
Yeah.
That's intentional acts by the people who created the chairs and so on,
Mhm.
right?
We can go to belief number five, which is internalization is an uncritical, passive process incorporating what others do
Yeah,
to our
yeah,
minds without participating or
yeah,
transforming what we experienced. We
yeah,
already covered that, I think. Uh,
yes.
it's
It's a
nonetheless.
transformative process.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
We wrote about that in our 2006 book, but nobody paid much attention to it apparently because they see it as a passive, you know.
Okay. And then belief six is SET only applies when it comes to collaborative learning in classrooms. Not everyday experiences, no one-to-one classes, no.
I don't see how it wouldn't apply to one-to-one classes, right? I mean, SET is a theory of human development, a general theory of human development. It wasn't intended as a pedagogical theory, although it has a strong pedagogical component to it. because Vygotsky argued that education is a particular form of development that doesn't happen in the everyday world, right? So it doesn't mean that you can't learn language in the everyday world. It's not an argument that says this is a theory that says you can only learn language in a classroom or a formal setting. That's not what it's saying. It's saying for certain individuals at certain stages of their life, particularly late learners, an optimal way of doing this is in a classroom, in a systematically organized form of development, what Vygotsky labeled artificial development. It's artificial because it's systematically and intentionally created, as opposed to the everyday world, which is not very systematic. It's pretty messy, right? You don't have access to, look, here's a good example. I figured this out.
Mm-hmm.
My wife is a native German speaker. And we visit Germany twice a year probably, and I'm immersed in German for the past 40 years, right? And I calculated the number of hours that I've actually been immersed in German. It works out to something like 25,000 hours of immersion.
That's a lot.
Right? It's a lot, but my German is still rudimentary.
Okay.
It's still, I could never write a paper in German. I can read a little bit of Vygotsky in German because I know the content. I can read a basic newspaper. I couldn't read Goethe or Kafka or anything like that in German, right? It's rudimentary. I need pedagogy. I had no pedagogy. It's just simply everyday learning. My wife has spent 150,000 more hours in an English-speaking environment than she has in German-speaking environment. She came to this country when she was 24 years old, right? I calculated just roughly the number of hours that she spent, and she still has gaps in her English. She still has problems with tense marking. She still has problems with word final devoicing, because German doesn't have voiceless consonants at the end of words, right? She still has problems with that. She can't hear the difference between send and sent. She has a hard time with that, and so on. And yet she's had 150,000 more hours in the English than she has in German. And she made her living as a professor in English. She wrote texts in English. She taught in English.
Yes.
And still there is this. So there's something missing from this everyday experience that I think Vygotsky was onto, that education is not just a place where you learn stuff. It's a place where you develop in a unique kind of way.
Okay. Yeah. And this is very counter to some other pedagogies which are more naturalistic.
Yeah, this implicit teaching, yeah, I think is a real problem. I do.
Yeah. And well, I guess this belief, I put it here in the research section because I think some people may have the idea that SAT can only be researched through qualitative means and it only happens in classrooms, while the research extends beyond that and it extends beyond LSLA. And there's, for example, Tomasello's research with chimp-cell children, many things in psychology that would serve as a base for the theory, and it includes ideas on neurology, psychology. It really has a very big background that we may not be able to see from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, Vygotsky and Luria went to med school in order to learn about the human brain, because they knew that the brain mattered. And a lot of people accused Vygotsky of ignoring the biological side of development, and that's not true. As more of his work has become available, and a lot of his writings have still been not made public, we see that he's written about the brain. He's written about the development of the brain as an organ, as a physical organ, right? To try to figure out how much the brain contributes versus how much culture contributes to development.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think it's a general theory of psychology. And that's why we thought, if it is, then it should be able to make a contribution to understanding the psychological processes involved in learning a second language,
Very good.
right?
Very good. Now, another question regarding research is that, well, a central assumption in some very widely used statistical traditions is that powerful effects of interventions are seen in averages, and especially when the variation in those averages is low. So could the assumptions of SCT, the epistemological, the ontological assumptions of SCT be reconciled with these statistical traditions?
I think let me say this about counting things in statistics. Vygotsky and Luria counted things when they had to count things. They used statistics when statistics made sense. So to say that this bifurcation that you see in the field of SLA between quantitative and qualitative researchers makes absolutely no sense in terms of the theory. When the theory had to analyze things qualitatively, it did. When they had to quantify things, they did. When they had to count things, they did. The problem about the counting that I think some contemporary psychologists have written about, not only within the Vygotsky school, is that sometimes, and this goes for general psychology as well as SLA, we try to measure things that aren't measurable or that we haven't proven to be measurable. So how do you know that proficiency is actually measurable in any sense of real measurement, right? We talk about measuring IQ. We talk about measuring proficiency, but you haven't proven that it's measurable in the same way that temperature is measurable, or that height is measurable, or that weight is measurable, right? So when you measure somebody's height, to be 6 feet tall, you know that that person had to at some point be 5 feet tall. You can't get to 6 without going through 5, right?
Yeah.
But how do you know that when you do proficiency, that proficiency is scalable? I mean, we just assume that it is. You haven't proven that it's scalable, right? And so there's a lot of statistical analysis. Another area that I think is really problematic is motivation, where people have tried to develop motivational scales, right? These Likert scales, as if you could actually measure motivation, and that on a Likert scale, a 5 for me is the same as the 5 for you, right? It's like, I don't know if you in Hong Kong, but in the US, when you go to a doctor's office nowadays, they have these pictures of faces
Yes.
with, right, where you have to say how much something hurts, the amount of pain, right? Is it a 5? Is it a 6? And you have to look at the face and say, well, you know, is my level of pain at 6 the same as your level of pain at 6?
Yeah.
But height is this 5 feet is 5 feet no matter where you are in the world. It's 5 feet or 2 meters. It's the same no matter where, right?
Yeah.
So this to me is a real problem. Vygotsky, in a sense, didn't measure, they counted things that were countable. And they used statistics when statistics made sense, but they didn't try to measure everything. Because certain things like emotions, motivation,
Yes.
are probably not measurable.
Yeah. So after all, very highly complex constructs, and even the words we use, like motivation.
Yeah.
It's socially constructed, number one, and then the way we measure it, it depends on a cultural filter, et cetera, et cetera. Like
yeah. And by using the term measure doesn't make it measurable.
Okay. Now, let's go to part 4 and final part. It's about the perceived incompatibility of other theories with SCT.
Mhm.
And I would like to start this with a disclaimer that, well, learning about theories is really, really difficult. And you may be able to tell your own experience because you have mentioned, like, it took me years to figure out blah, blah, blah. And we have all these comments that, yeah, gaining a true understanding of certain concepts really takes a very, very long time. And so when we try to comment on other theories with other people who have also spent their entire life grasping very complex ideas, we may not be able to characterize the concepts in very accurate ways sometimes. So it's a little disclaimer when we compare theories.
I want to say something about theories.
Yes.
I think one of the problems is that the field doesn't spend enough time on what theories are about. So we have courses on SLA theories. So we teach you Krashen, we teach you uh, dynamic systems theory, maybe sociocultural theory, maybe socialization theory. But we don't teach the whole concept of theory.
Mm.
What theories are good for, where do they come from, why we need them, right? We spend way more time on methodology, research methodology, right? And consequently, what happens is we assume that any methodology goes with any theory.
Mm.
And that's a real problem. And Vygotsky wrote a lot about that at the very beginning of his academic life, that the methodology has to meet the theory. You can't, he objected to psychology borrowing methods from the hard sciences into psychology, right? That's why he said the method is developmental, it's historical for psychology. That's how you explain the formation of human consciousness. You don't take methods from experimental physics into the field of psychology. That's not going to get you anywhere because it can't distinguish the biological from the cultural. That's why he objected uh, to some of the work that the reflexologists were doing because they weren't able to separate out the biological from the social, from the cultural, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it would be really good to have a course in philosophy of science, for example,
Yeah.
would be really helpful as part of the curriculum for applied linguistics or SLA degrees, and not just courses in methodology,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
that's the end all and be all, because that's where I think people get messed up and they don't appreciate why theories really matter. And
Yeah.
not everything we call a theory is a theory,
Mm.
right? Some are like learner autonomy. That's not a theory. That's just a hypothesis or an idea that somebody had. I'm not sure that's a full-blown theory.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah. That's well, that's why I in part why I created this series on open theory, because I consider that theory is the in a way the beginning. We're looking for explanations. We make these constructs, then we need methods to measure, and the methods, well, they depend on these assumptions about the explanation. And then the
Yes.
result of empirical testing and all these things we observe, the result is the explanation, which is theory
Yes.
again. So it's really the beginning, the means, and the end of science. So that's
Yeah.
why I think we need an open science initiative on theories as well. My first question would be SCT and Krashen. So how does SCT understand this idea of input?
Yeah. Input is not a concept in the theory.
Mhm.
Input, I think Leo Van Leer, I think, had a nice way of talking about this as affordances, that is, opportunities. But input is very much, of course, this comes from the computer metaphor, right? And we're moving beyond the computer metaphor now, I think, I hope, in cognitive science and in SLA. But and it's very much a solipsistic way of thinking about things, right? It's very much about the isolated individual taking something from the environment, right? And putting it in, talking about internalization, right? In a perverse kind of way. Um, so input doesn't make any sense.
Mhm.
Uh, we would want to talk about mediation and not input, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't belong within the theory. It's anathema to the theory, right?
But what would be the difference between we talked about this in an email. So you seem to see one clash between SCT and or possible clash between SCT and CDST when it comes to two views, which is the metaphysical view and the dialectical view. So how do
Yeah.
do these two views clash?
Okay, I've spent a fair amount of time trying to understand CDST, which goes back to your question about, the depth of understanding of other theories, right? That we spend all of our time in our own tribe, or that we go in, explore other tribes. And I've spent a lot of time, I spent most of my life trying to understand generative theory, right? And I followed Chomsky up until, I don't know, the late 90s, early 2000s. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand CDST. And I'm not saying that I fully understand all the subtleties of the theory, but what I don't see in CDST and is a notion of dialectics, whereby, as I explained earlier, there are two poles that are necessary for something to exist. What I worry about, and I could be wrong, what I worry about in CDST is, yes, they see things influencing and interacting with each other, but it could be, is this a metaphysical view where things just sort of bump into each other? Or is it a necessary relationship at an internal level, as you would see between, for example, the example that I like to give is Marx's example of production and consumption, right? So if you think of production and consumption, they form a dialectical relationship whereby one is impossible without the other, right? So consumption without production is impossible, and production without consumption is useless. So if you keep producing stuff and nobody's consuming it, it 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 not, it's useless, right? But you can't consume something unless it's produced. And where you see this coming together in a really nice way is in food, because food, that is what you ingest, is consumed, but at the same time, it produces your body, right? So you have production and consumption in a necessary relationship that at the same time that it's consumed, it's also producing at the same time, right? So that's the way to think about dialectics. And I'm not sure I see that kind of relationship in CDST. I worry that it might be a metaphysical view where, of course, entities are independent and aren't necessarily related to each other, but they can be related. They can come together, right? And one thing influences the other. But I don't know if it's a necessarily dialectical kind of relationship. The other
So,
thing that worries me about CDST is that, at least as it manifested in L2, is that uh, it likes this idea of these external relationships between entities, right? But at the same time, it seems to allow for the cognitive view of development. Because if you read some of Diane's writings, her 2003 book on grammaring, she writes about, CDST, but then she says you have to allow for the fact that there are these developmental sequences that are driven by internal mechanisms. So I don't know how that squares with the view that CDSC seems to be supporting about the social and these sort of external things coming together. I don't know how that squares, right?
it will.
I don't see that. The other problem you have is the educational problem, which has been raised by other people, not just about, not about L2, but general about education. Um, and that's the issue of accountability. If everything is about, sort of determined by the initial state of something, the initial condition, um, how can you possibly teach people, classes of people to develop, and how can they be held accountable for their behavior, right? How can you assess them? How can you be accountable for what it is you're developing? Because it seems to all depend on this kind of randomness, right, of the initial conditions. And so I worry about that when it comes to CDST.
Interesting. Very
So, but again, I'm basing it only on my reading of the literature. SET, I think, I think what Vygotsky says about language acquisition outside of the classroom meshes really well with usage-based models, because Vygotsky claims that children learning their language move towards the ideal, and the ideal is represented. It's not a Platonic ideal, but it's an ideal represented in the models of adult speech, right? So that seems to me to resonate very well with usage-based research, right? But it's in the classroom where you get the difference, right? In formal education. But in terms of sort of natural everyday language acquisition, it meshes pretty well with usage-based theory, right? We're doing it. We're starting to do a collaborative project with Pieneman's group. We're in the early stages of it. And what's nice about this is you have two different theories that have completely different views. One is a sociogenetic theory, and one is an internal cognitive theory.